My manager asked me to spend 6 months mentoring the woman who would eventually take over my department, and I said yes, without a single moment of hesitation, because that's the kind of person I've always tried to be. What I didn't know was that I wasn't training my successor. I was training someone to cover the exact tracks she'd already been leaving for over a year, and by the time I figured it out, she'd made sure everything pointed back to me. My name is Priya, and this is the story of the most disorienting 8 months of my professional life. The 6 months I spent unknowingly helping someone frame me for embezzlement, and the 2 months it took afterward to prove I hadn't done what the evidence, on its surface, seemed to show so clearly. I'd worked at Halverson Manufacturing for 9 years by the time this started, working my way up from an entry-level accounting position to director of financial operations, overseeing a department of 6 people responsible for the company's day-to-day financial management, vendor payments, and internal auditing processes. I want to be clear that I say this not to establish some inflated sense of my own competence, but because it matters to understanding how thoroughly the events that followed upended 9 years of professional identity I'd built through genuinely careful, meticulous work. 18 months ago, our CFO, a measured, generally fair man named Richard, called me into his office to discuss a planned leadership transition. The company was expanding into a second regional office, and Richard wanted me to eventually move into a broader operations role overseeing both locations, a promotion I'd been quietly hoping for over the preceding 2 years. That transition, he explained, would require training a replacement for my current position, someone who could take over the day-to-day financial operations of our original office while I shifted focus to the expanded responsibilities. The person selected for that role was a woman named Vanessa, hired specifically for this transition after an external search process I wasn't heavily involved in, though I sat in on her final interview and genuinely liked her. Sharp, personable, with a solid resume from a mid-sized logistics company where she'd apparently handled similarly complex financial operations. I remember thinking, after that interview, that Richard had made a strong choice, someone who seemed capable of stepping into a role I'd spent 9 years building expertise in without too steep a learning curve. I began mentoring Vanessa immediately after she started, 6 months before my own planned transition to the expanded role. I walked her through every system, every process, every relationship with vendors and internal stakeholders that I developed over nearly a decade. I gave her access to accounts, taught her our reconciliation processes, explained the specific quirks of our aging financial software that had never been fully upgraded, the kind of institutional knowledge that exists in every long-tenured employee's head and rarely gets written down anywhere formal. I want to describe what those 6 months actually felt like from my perspective, because understanding my genuine trust in that process is essential to understanding how completely I failed to notice what was actually happening underneath it. Vanessa was, by every outward measure, an excellent trainee, asking thoughtful questions, picking up complex processes quickly, building genuine rapport with the rest of my team. I found myself, over those months, actually enjoying the mentorship process, feeling a kind of professional pride in preparing someone capable to eventually take over work I'd invested nearly a decade of my career into. What I didn't know, throughout those 6 months, was that Vanessa had begun, almost immediately after gaining system access, diverting small amounts of money through a series of fraudulent vendor payments. Invoices for services never actually rendered, submitted to vendors whose accounts she'd either created herself using slightly altered versions of legitimate vendor names, or, in a smaller number of cases, compromised existing vendor accounts to redirect payments to accounts she controlled. The scale of what she was doing, I would later learn, was deliberately modest at first, payments small enough to avoid triggering the kind of scrutiny larger discrepancies would draw, spread across enough different vendor relationships that no single relationship showed an obviously suspicious pattern. Over the roughly 14 months she ultimately had access to our systems, she diverted just over $340,000, an amount that, distributed carefully enough across our department's overall transaction volume, remained invisible to normal oversight processes for far longer than it probably should have. The first hint that something was wrong came about 7 months after Vanessa started, roughly a month into her handling the department more independently as my own transition to the expanded role began accelerating. Our external auditor, conducting what was meant to be a routine annual review, flagged several vendor payments with what he described, in his initial note to Richard, as documentation inconsistencies warranting further review. Nothing alarming on its face, the kind of minor flag that routine audits surface fairly regularly without necessarily indicating anything serious. I remember Richard mentioning this to me almost in passing during an otherwise ordinary check-in about my transition timeline. Auditor found a few things that need cleaning up in the vendor files, Probably just some documentation gaps from the system migration last year. Can you have Vanessa pull the relevant records together for his follow-up? I passed that request directly to Vanessa, entirely unaware that I was, in that moment, handing the person responsible for the discrepancies direct control over how those discrepancies would be explained and documented for the auditor reviewing them. Vanessa handled that initial audit follow-up with what I now understand, in hindsight, was remarkably calculated skill. She provided explanations for each flag transaction that sounded plausible on their surface. Vendor name changes due to business restructuring, delayed invoicing catching up from the system migration, minor administrative errors and categorization that she'd already corrected. The auditor, satisfied with these explanations at the time, closed out that particular review without escalating further, an outcome that, I would later learn, Vanessa had actively worked to engineer through the specific way she framed and documented each response. I want to be honest that I didn't personally review the details of her responses to that audit closely at the time, trusting, as I had throughout her entire training period, that she was handling the process competently. This trust, extended in complete good faith based on 6 months of what appeared to be genuinely excellent work, would later become one of the central pieces of evidence used against me, once the full scope of what had actually been happening finally came to light. My formal transition to the expanded operations role happened about 2 months after that first audit flag, at which point Vanessa took over full, independent responsibility for the department I'd led for 9 years. I remained peripherally aware of the department's activities, as would be expected of someone in my new broader role, but I no longer had the same daily, granular visibility into every transaction that I'd maintained throughout my 9 years in that specific position. The scheme, once Vanessa had full independent control, appears to have accelerated significantly. Over the following 7 months, the pace and scale of the fraudulent transactions increased substantially, though still calibrated carefully enough to avoid triggering obvious red flags in our standard reporting processes. It was, ultimately, a second, more thorough audit, this one prompted by a routine annual compliance review rather than any specific suspicion, that finally surfaced the full pattern nearly 14 months after Vanessa had first gained system access. I received a call from Richard on a Thursday afternoon, his voice carrying a formality I immediately recognized as significant. "Priya, I need you to come to my office. We have a serious situation with the department's financial records, and given your role in training Vanessa and your prior oversight of these systems, I need to understand exactly what you know." I want to describe the specific, disorienting shock of walking into that meeting, expecting to discuss some administrative issue, and instead finding myself facing a forensic accountant Richard had brought in, along with our head of HR and, unexpectedly, our company's general counsel. The room had the particular, careful arrangement of furniture that I would later come to recognize as standard practice for exactly this kind of internal investigation meeting. Chairs positioned to observe reactions, a single folder placed deliberately in the center of the table, everyone's expression carefully neutral in a way that felt, in the moment, far more alarming than open hostility would have. The forensic accountant walked me through a timeline of fraudulent transactions spanning 14 months, totaling over $340,000, and asked me, directly, to explain several specific decisions and approvals that appeared, on the documentation, to bear my authorization. I sat in that room, my heart pounding, trying to process what I was seeing, because several of the documents in front of me genuinely did appear to carry my electronic approval signature on transactions I had absolutely no memory of ever reviewing, let alone approving. "I don't understand," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I never approved these. I don't even recognize most of these vendor names." The forensic accountant, a careful, methodical woman named Diane, explained something that made the room feel like it was tilting slightly around me. Several of these transactions were processed during the training period, while you still had primary system access alongside Vanessa. The approval logs show your credentials as the authorizing signature. I need to explain, for anyone unfamiliar with how these systems typically work, how something like this becomes possible without the actual account holder's knowledge. During the 6-month training period, Vanessa and I had, at Richard's own suggestion, established a shared workflow where she would prepare transactions for review and I would provide final approval, a completely standard mentorship practice meant to let a trainee build proficiency while maintaining appropriate oversight. What I didn't know, until Diane walked me through the technical audit trail in painstaking detail, was that Vanessa had, on a specific and limited number of occasions, submitted fraudulent transactions for approval using a batch processing feature in our system that allowed multiple transactions to be approved simultaneously through a single confirmation click. A feature meant to streamline routine, low-risk approvals, which she had exploited by burying individual fraudulent transactions. Within larger, legitimate batches I had approved without reviewing every single line item individually, trusting, as any reasonable person training a new employee might, that the batch had been prepared honestly. "This doesn't mean you did this deliberately," Diane said, in what I now recognize was a genuinely fair, careful attempt to walk me through the technical reality without either accusing me outright or dismissing the serious question my approval credentials raised. "But I need you to understand why this looks the way it looks, and why we need to investigate thoroughly before drawing any conclusions." The following 6 weeks were, without exaggeration, among the most frightening and disorienting of my entire professional life. I was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation, a standard, necessary precaution, Richard assured me, not an accusation, though it felt, from the inside, disturbingly close to one. I hired my own attorney, a decision that felt surreal for someone who had spent 9 years building a reputation for meticulous, trustworthy financial stewardship, now needing legal representation to prove I hadn't committed the exact kind of fraud I'd spent my entire career specifically trained to detect and prevent. I want to describe what those 6 weeks did to my sense of my own professional identity, because I think it's the part of this story that surprises people most when I tell it. It wasn't just the fear of potential legal consequences, though that fear was real and constant throughout the entire period. It was something closer to a kind of existential professional vertigo, spending 9 years building a career on precision, on catching exactly this kind of discrepancy before it could grow into something larger, and then finding myself unable to fully trust my own memory of events, wondering, in my most anxious moments, whether I had somehow, through some lapse in attention I couldn't fully account for, actually approved something I shouldn't have, even though every instinct I had insisted. That wasn't possible. My attorney, a sharp, patient woman named Carla who specialized in exactly this kind of complex financial dispute, walked me through a strategy focused on demonstrating the technical reality of how the batch approval exploit worked, alongside establishing a clear behavioral and financial pattern that distinguished my conduct from Vanessa's throughout the entire period in question. "The good news," Carla told me, during our second meeting, "is that fraud like this almost always leaves a financial trail, and that trail almost never points toward the person who isn't actually benefiting from it. We need to find where this money actually went, because I promise you, it isn't sitting in your accounts." That became the central focus of the investigation over the following weeks, not just proving the technical mechanism of how the fraudulent transactions had been embedded within legitimate batches, but tracing the actual destination of the diverted funds, establishing definitively who had actually profited from 14 months of careful, deliberate theft. The forensic investigation, once fully underway, moved faster than I expected, largely because Vanessa, it turned out, had been considerably less careful about concealing her personal financial activity than she had been about structuring the fraudulent transactions themselves. Investigators traced the diverted funds through a series of accounts that ultimately connected back to Vanessa's own personal banking activity, payments toward a significant personal debt she'd apparently been carrying from before joining the company, along with a pattern of luxury purchases that, once cross-referenced against her actual salary, created a financial profile entirely inconsistent with her legitimate income, but strikingly consistent with the timeline and scale of the missing $340,000. I was cleared of any wrongdoing 5.5 weeks after being placed on leave, in a meeting where Richard, visibly uncomfortable, apologized directly for the necessity of the investigation while acknowledging that the evidence, once fully understood, made unmistakably clear that I had been an unknowing tool in Vanessa's scheme rather than any kind of willing participant. "I need you to understand," he told me, "that we had to take the approval trail seriously, given what it initially appeared to show. But the full picture is completely different from what it looked like at first, and I'm sorry for what these 6 weeks put you through." I appreciated the apology, genuinely, though I also found myself, in the weeks that followed, unable to fully return to the same easy trust and institutional process that I'd operated with throughout my previous 9 years at the company. Being formally investigated for something I hadn't done, even when that investigation ultimately vindicated me, left a mark that a single apology, however sincere, couldn't fully erase. Vanessa was terminated immediately once the investigation's findings were finalized, and the company subsequently pursued both criminal charges and civil action to recover the stolen funds. I testified during the criminal proceedings, months later, describing in careful, factual detail the training process, the batch approval system, and my complete lack of awareness of the fraudulent transactions embedded within work I had trusted, in good faith, Throughout an entire 6-month mentorship, I'd approached with genuine professional pride. Vanessa was ultimately convicted, sentenced to several years in prison alongside a restitution order for the full amount stolen. Though I understand from later conversations with Richard that actual recovery of the funds has been slow and partial, much of the money apparently already spent by the time the investigation concluded. I don't know the full details of her sentencing or current circumstances, and I've made a deliberate choice not to seek that information out, understanding that continued focus on her fate doesn't particularly serve my own recovery from what those 8 months put me through. What I think about most, in the time since this all resolved, isn't actually the financial fraud itself, devastating as its scale genuinely was for the company. It's the specific, calculated cruelty of using my own professional generosity, my genuine effort to mentor someone well, to be the kind of colleague who trains a replacement thoroughly rather than protectively guarding institutional knowledge, as the exact mechanism through which she built a cover story that nearly destroyed my career and reputation. Vanessa didn't just steal money from the company. She specifically, deliberately exploited the trust inherent in a mentorship relationship, understanding, correctly, that a trainer reviewing a trainee's batched work would extend exactly the kind of good faith trust that made her scheme both possible and, for a frightening 6 weeks, nearly successful in implicating the wrong person entirely. I've returned to my expanded operations role, now overseeing both regional offices, a position I've held for just over a year at this point. The company has, since this happened, implemented significantly more rigorous approval processes, eliminating the batch approval feature that made Vanessa's specific scheme possible and requiring individual review and sign-off on every transaction above a much lower threshold than our previous system required. I was heavily involved in designing these new safeguards, a process that, while professionally validating in some ways, also required me to spend considerable time reconstructing, in painful detail, exactly how the exploit had worked. Not the most comfortable use of my expertise, but one I approached with a determination to make sure no future colleague of mine ever finds themselves in the position I spent those 6 weeks occupying. I've also become, in the time since, considerably more careful about the specific mechanics of trust in professional mentorship relationships, not less willing to train and support new colleagues, which I still believe is genuinely important work, but more attentive to the specific systems and processes through which that trust operates, understanding now, in a way I didn't fully appreciate before, that good faith and careful verification aren't actually opposites, and that the most generous mentorship still benefits from maintaining clear, individually reviewed accountability at every step. Richard and I have talked, more than once since this all resolved, about the specific irony at the center of the entire situation, that the company's own well-intentioned effort to build a smooth, efficient training and transition process, streamlined through features like batch approval specifically to make mentorship easier and faster, had inadvertently created the exact vulnerability Vanessa needed to build her scheme. Neither of us blames the original system design entirely. Hindsight makes vulnerabilities obvious in ways they rarely are in the moment a system is first built. But I think we both carry a quieter, more permanent understanding now of how thoroughly good intentions and genuine efficiency can, without anyone fully realizing it, create exactly the conditions someone determined enough will eventually learn to exploit. I still think, sometimes, about the specific 6 months I spent training Vanessa, genuinely proud of how quickly and capably she seemed to be learning. I've had to make peace with the fact that pride was, in its own way, real and valid at the time. Even though I now understand so much of what was actually happening underneath it, I don't think the lesson here is to never again feel that kind of professional pride in mentoring someone well. I think the lesson, the one I actually carry forward now, is that pride and vigilance can, and probably should, exist together, rather than one crowding out the space for the other. If you've ever had someone deliberately exploit your professional trust or generosity to cover their own wrongdoing, leaving you to prove your innocence for something you never knew was happening around you, I want to hear how you navigated it. I used to believe that thorough, careful training was simply good professional practice, full stop, without much more complexity to consider. I've learned, in the hardest possible way, that generosity and vigilance need to coexist, and that the people most capable of building an elaborate deception are often exactly the ones who understand, better than anyone else, precisely how much good faith the people around them are likely to extend.